Hi, hello, bonjour, and namaste. This is Out of the Clouds, a podcast at the crossroads between business and mindfulness, and I'm your host, Anne V. Muhlethaler. Today, I am delighted to be joined by a very inspiring leader, one with a unique background, Debjani Biswas. Debjani is a chemical engineer with 2 masters under her belt, a certified executive coach, an emotional intelligence practitioner. She is also a former Fortune 50 executive and is now a best-selling author, a speaker, and under the banner of her consultancy, Coachieve, she applies her unique background of engineering, diversity, and strategy to tackle the question, what is the business impact of inclusion at work? Debjani is also a 2-time TEDx speaker, and her talks have garnered in the millions of views. So are you impressed? I certainly am. Now, I had the immense pleasure of discovering Debjani's work after she shared a recent podcast interview she'd done, one that she passed onto an online group that we're both members of. And this is what gave me the opportunity to find out about who she was, about her thinking, her work ethics, her commitment to inclusion. And I heard about one of her books, Miserably Successful No More. And as I heard the title, the penny dropped for me. And I thought, oof, I need to read that. And I probably need to speak to this woman. I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about. And here we are a few weeks later. Now, coming back to the content of our conversation, so Debjani tells me her story starting from a very privileged background in India to her fascination with math, the powerful influence of her grandfather and her parents on her scientific studies, the advocacy of her father that helped her pursue a path that wasn't a normal one, not for a girl, not at the time that she started and studied at the prestigious IIT. We talk about her move to the United States and the moment of reckoning that precipitated her away from her corporate career and into this brand new path, one that she formed to become an inclusion catalyst or an exclusion exterminator. But we'll talk about that. Of course, we touch on what she calls the miserably successful epidemic, how to gain power over stress, the meaning of being a catalyst for others' growth and change, and how we can all move to actively reduce exclusion. Finally, we also chat about the practices which Debjani finds grounding and supportive in her daily life. So it was an absolute joy to get to know her over the couple of conversations that we've had, and I'm really thrilled to be inviting you to discover this woman's story and the work that she does in the world, one that will hopefully really make a dent in inequity as it exists today. So here is my interview with Debjani Biswas. Happy listening. Debjani, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Out of the Clouds.
Thank you so much, Anne, for inviting me.
Now, when was the first time that you heard the sentence, "You don't look like an engineer"?
So I think I heard it on and off ever since I graduated from engineering school. But I think I heard it the most. I worked for 17 years at Texas Instruments. So after Indiana, we moved to Texas, and I was in Dallas in Texas. And when I was working in TI, which is essentially a very engineering-based organization, I would often be in a room, a group full of engineers. And that was where I would often be the only person, whether it was in the wafer fab, or I used to teach statistical process control to a group of engineers, or a lot of the wafer fab protocol within that industry, the semiconductor industry. I would hear that over and over again. There were some funny incidents where I'd be in the room. Someone would assume I was the administrative assistant and say, "Hey, I like my coffee with black with a sugar." And there was just a whole lot of, I think that was my first steady full-time work job and in the United States. And I think I heard it a lot at work.
How did that make you feel?
It was surprising. And in the beginning, I got a little bit defensive. And then towards the end, I would just roll with it. And my sense of humor asserted itself. So if someone would tell me how they had their coffee, I would say, how interesting. I have mine with milk and sugar. So you can be defensive about stuff, or you can just say, this is the world. And this is why we are in this world, is because that's our mission or our vision, or this is our purpose. There's something happening here, and we are uniquely positioned to maybe move the needle forward in some directions. I was quite defensive and touchy and annoyed for a while. And then I don't know, calm and peace settled on me. And I just decided that this was a message that I needed to share. And I don't think people start off the day with biases or thinking they want to hurt someone's feelings. I think it's just we are programmed to think certain things should be. And so when something's different, we can either be curious and ask questions about why something looks different or sounds different, or we can say, this is wrong, and judge that thing. So that's our choice.
Now, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about that, because in the coaching and the consulting that I do, I work with a lot of clients who find it challenging to talk about themselves for various reasons and various mediums. I wonder, how did this lived experience of bias around your culture and your job, right? Your passion for math and your engineering skills, how did it challenge you, or perhaps not, to help you talk about who you are and what you do?
So it was more or less a very quiet one-on-one kind of interaction set for the longest time. And then I moved from Texas Instruments to PepsiCo. And then within a couple of years, they had this huge reduction in force, and I was let go. I was laid off as part of the reduction in force. And as a result, I then moved to a much more public career, where now I give keynotes, and then I started writing books, and I started doing workshops. What I had done for decades is when events would take place where I would have examples either of negative or positive bias, or maybe some stereotypical comment or thought, I had this folder where I would just, the introvert in me, I'm a paid extrovert, so I'm essentially an introvert by nature. And so I would just type notes to myself. I would email myself, and had a folder, a big folder, which ended up making the first book, Unleash the Power of Diversity, super easy, because I had pages and pages of emails I had sent to myself. So really, a lot of these lived experiences, I knew my memory wasn't going to be that great that 10 years later I would remember every single thing that people said, did, or how I experienced Greece as being so amazing. So it was, part of it was different countries opening my eyes, traveling there. Part of it was things people said to me. Part of it was being an observer and seeing interactions among other people. I just did it in a more inward, quiet way and typed it to myself for years and years. But then when I got laid off and I decided on a different career, my son encouraged me to write my first book because I'd been talking about it for a while. And so when I started doing, that's when I went into much more of a vocal career choice.
Now, I've heard you tell the story in the book and in other podcasts about how you were laid off. But this was obviously a huge shock. You were incredibly successful. You had also been on the other side of the chopping block, right? You had let people go. I'd like to understand what happened after. I know that your son recommended that you start writing a book, but what happens when suddenly the rug gets pulled from under you? What was your life like then, before you got started?
Yes, so I had spent a lot of time at Texas Instruments, 17 years. And then I had just recently moved to PepsiCo. So it was 2 years in PepsiCo. And then I got laid off from there. So I didn't have a lot of loyalty, perhaps, or advocacy. And it was a big movement. And when it happened, I was actually in shock at the beginning. It was, I think, a big blow to my ego. It was also, for a while, I almost was ashamed to tell people I was laid off. even though it was more than one person, even though I had not done anything wrong, it was just all those messages in my head saying, oh, keep it quiet. And that's why when I encourage people, don't keep it quiet. Ask for help. Tell people it is probably this door is closing. It's going to open bigger doors, windows, something even better. But it took me a long while. I got so spoiled. I got so used to, if I had to do a PowerPoint presentation, I would just have some thoughts and ideas and I would just hand it to someone and someone else would do all the visuals for me. I was so used to just having a team of people that were working, and I was just used to having a lot of things. So I think it was two things that happened together. One was it was a real feeling of isolation. Unfortunately, the timing also coincided with a very big change in my personal life, as well as a big health issue. So I had this perfect trifecta of things happening within a short period of time. I think it was like a crucible. And I think it was hot enough as a crucible that by the time I jumped out of that crucible, my give a damn was completely broken. And I was just like, I've just always played by the rules and all these things have happened. So now, universe, here I come.
I love it. Oh, that's very interesting. Your give a damn was broken.
Yes.
So tell me about the first book and the Unleashing the Power of Diversity. I absolutely love the fact that for years you had emailed yourself with ideas. That sounds absolutely genius. But what was it about that message that got your juices flowing and that just got you to put this message out in the world?
So one of the biggest things that I wanted to share from Unleash the Power of Diversity, the tagline is multicultural competence for business results. So I have a bias and stereotyping framework there called the 5 judgments. And it talks about how we should be judging each other on our work product or output. But instead of that is actually the 5th of the 5 judgments. There are 4 judgments that precede looking at a person's caliber of work or output. And it starts off with your visual cues of how do you look, auditory cues, how do you sound, and, just all this reputational currency. What do you think you know about someone from India or Switzerland? Or what is the brand of that particular country, the culture of your being a female or a male? So, and then the 4th judgment is distinguishing markers. And so I just really wanted to talk about what is it that makes a human being unique. And I drew from areas such as marketing, as well as I had read about genetics. Like in DNA, you have specific markers, genetic markers. And so I thought human beings have distinguishing markers, which could be physical or situational or behavioral. And so just this whole framework about how bias and stereotyping happens, I really wanted to share that message because I wanted to shine a light on the fact that sometimes we are giving other people a job because we got turned off by how a person looks or sounds or what we think we know about their country, when that has nothing to do with the job itself. If I'm sitting in an office and coding, it shouldn't really matter if you don't like the clothes that I'm wearing, because what you're doing is coding. It's the reason you have the television show The Voice, that don't actually see the person, you just hear them, and then you turn around if you like their voice. That is an example of going to the work product or the output first. I really wanted in Unleash the Power of Diversity to talk about what are the things that we can do so that we can include every human being in this planet and not see one person as more than and one person as less than. I've been in the mainstream and I've been in the singularity population, the smaller group. And if we see the smaller group as being like an orchid, rare and beautiful, that's one way of looking at it. Or we can see the smaller group as a group which is a challenge for us to make them just like the mainstream. So that's why I really wanted to write Unleash the Power of Diversity.
That's very interesting. I remember, I'm going to read that quote. from your TEDx talk on gender bias. Actually, on several times during that talk, I physically felt my heart sink. When you just feel just like sad to hear the facts.
Yeah.
Even just reading it, it just makes me, it's funny how I keep the memory of this.
Yes.
You said, we say don't judge a book by its cover. But if human beings were books, I believe then more than half the time we judge women by their covers and men by their contents. I know it's true. I find it very painful to hear. What can we do about that?
So I think the first step, and before I go into the answer, I want to tell you that it really warms my heart when someone has a visceral reaction to something I have said or written, because that's when change happens. When the example or the story lands to the point where you actually feel a pure, genuine emotion of sadness that this is how the world is, of joy that this is the possibility in the world, that is when we actually move forward. So I just want to start by saying that you just made my day or my week with that. So the engineer in me, I'm always counting things. So the first thing is to say, is this true? So a few ways that we can test whether this is true or not is to take proxies. And if you take a proxy for whether this is true or not, it's very easy to pull the data on the number of plastic surgeries that are done by gender. That would be an example of appearance being more important with one gender than the other. Another way to pull the data would be to see, recently we've had a few movies in Hollywood where there are female protagonists and a couple of female directors. But essentially, if you look at storylines over the decades of movies and you look at the role of the female is more as eye candy, and the role of the male is the protagonist or the hero most often. So there are multiple ways in which to test that hypothesis about we are looking at women more in terms of as how they look and more men as what they produce. So I think what we can do about that first is recognizing that, asking ourselves, go really young, go right back into social media feed or look at Facebook and say, I have this beautiful little daughter or beautiful little granddaughter. And those are the only descriptors of how sweet she is and polite and kind she is. And then I have this tough little boy, or I have such a smart little grandson, and I'm giving him a science kit, and he's going to come play sports with me. He's going to do this, and she's going to play dolls. When you look at computer science, the age at which you start coding is a huge factor in how proficient you become as time goes by. So when you look at classes, I'm talking about early education. The earlier, the better, whether it's with science, technology, engineering, and math, whether it's with any area, whether it's geography or history, but it's much more of a focus on understanding that, honestly, I didn't even realize this was a huge gift my parents gave to me. Looks were not a factor at all for me growing up. One of my IIT, my engineering classmates mentioned this. We had a mini reunion a few months ago and said they remembered me just walking around. I never really used much makeup other than lipstick and some foundation or something now. And I would, those days, not even use that. And I would walk around in these huge, baggy, oversized T-shirts. And it wasn't a thing. And all four of us, I think that was a gift that our parents gave us, is that we were a fairly attractive set of daughters, as other people used to say, not being like a show-offy person, but it wasn't that big of a deal. It was much more about what was in our brain than how we looked. And I think that messaging is really important. I'm perfectly okay with everyone looking, I hope, better than I used to look as a youngster when I was walking around with long T-shirts and whatever, not very well groomed. But at the same time, there is a happy medium. There is this space in the middle where you look well groomed and you look fine, but you're not obsessed with your appearance. you're thinking much more about the content of your mind than makeup and how you look. And changing that messaging is going to change the way we perceive first ourselves and then others.
Yeah, I was thinking also change and the content of your heart, because you talked in one of and I think in this TED talk about indeed the adjectives that what we say about little girls versus little boys, and almost never would the words kind get used about a boy, but that would always be an adjective that's used to describe a kind, sweet, gentle girl.
Yes.
And I was thinking about my younger brother or my cousin who were kind, gentle boys and who were also made to feel less than when they were not showing particularly masculine traits. And so
100%.
this weaves not just the gender
it's
bias.
In both directions.
Yeah, exactly. In all directions.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes I will go to gift cards and greeting cards when you say happy birthday cards or congratulations or wedding, whatever. And I just look at the little children's cards. And if you look at the little children's cards, there's like a lot of them with this whole Cinderella and Dream or Snow White and waiting for a prince to kiss you. There's a whole theme around that. And then there are all these superhero cards, and there aren't really little girl superhero cards. All the little boy cards are the superhero cards. This whole non-traditional career concept is something I really don't like for that reason.
I'd like to know which point in your career did you decide to become a coach?
I accidentally became a coach. While I was working, my second master's is in organizational strategy and international management. I studied at UT Dallas, locally here. And I was an OD consultant, organization development consultant. And my manager at the time, Barbara Weinberger, she is a very intuitive woman. So we had this internal consulting arm within TI, and we would be assigned to different organizations, different functions. And one day she took me aside and she said, this thing that you're doing with the senior leaders, that's called coaching, where you're talking to them, you're asking them some questions, you're helping them be more successful. There's a term for what you're doing, and it's called coaching. And I think that you're good enough at it that we in TI, we're going to pay for you to become a certified coach. So that was just something that she handed into my lap. I had no clue. I thought I was actually consulting with them on structure and strategy, but apparently I was also. So I went through the International Coach Federation. I became ACC and then PCC, Professional Certified Coach. UTD has a really good executive and career coaching program. So that's how I fell into coaching. I think this was, I want to say, about 15 years ago. It was completely eye-opening for me. I wish I had known about, I just did a session last week in New York on leader as coach with some senior leaders. And I was talking about some of the specific coaching skills from the ICF core coaching competencies, which will help leaders be better coaches. And I focused on 4 of them. I focused on presence, this coaching and executive presence, on direct communication, on listening, active listening, and powerful questions. So those were the 4 that I looked at. Any of them, holding people accountable. I just learned so much from the whole, not just coaching curriculum, but using a coaching approach, because I think much of my life, when you're in an area such as engineering or mathematics, so basically much of STEM, you're in tell mode. You're the expert of the facts and you're in tell mode. Having another tool in my toolkit where I could be in ask mode, where I could have the other person uncover what it is that they are good at or what is holding them back is powerful beyond what I had expected.
Yeah. I'm trying to not freak out because I love the idea of bringing the ICF core competencies to business leaders. Now, we talked about what it was like for you when things broke down and you wrote your first book. What prompted you to write a second book?
When I got laid off from PepsiCo, after the shock wore off and the ego and all that other part, the damaged, bruised ego, I calmed myself down a bit. I suddenly realized one day that I was actually quite peaceful. I still didn't have a job and I didn't really know where my career was going, but I had a level of calm and peace that I had not had in PepsiCo. It was not really a good match for me and my skills. So to be fair to them, I think it was a very good career decision on both ends for them to let go of me and then for me to start. But I suddenly realized that while I had been at PepsiCo, I had been miserably successful. So from a manager position at TI, I had moved to an executive position at PepsiCo, and I was getting paid obviously quite well and lots of perks and original artwork in my fancy office and all that nonsense. But at the end of the day, I was not really a match and I was miserably successful. And that phrase just got stuck in my mind. I was miserably successful. And then I started looking around and I started seeing that there was almost like this epidemic of people around me, because I used that phrase, and one of my MBA classmates from IIM, he immediately said, I need you to go and copyright that phrase, because by the time you write your book, Miserably Successful No More, somebody else is going to take that phrase. You just got me with that. It just gave me a gut response. And so I started thinking, my gosh, and I started testing it. Turns out so many of us are on autopilot and we're miserably successful. And if we have just one life to live, I'm not saying give up the success. I'm just saying be aware and work according to your passion and your purpose. Have fun, own things. I have one definition in that book about materialism, which I really like. Materialism isn't about not owning nice things, but it's about nice things not owning you. And I think that's the whole point of this book. The reason I wanted to write the book is that I was jolted out of this miserably successful career, and I was forced into this path, which I absolutely love. I mean, if you were to tell me that I would be in this point in my career and this life because I got laid off, I would be like, oh my gosh, why didn't this happen 20 years ago instead of 10 years ago? So that's why I wrote the book.
Mm. Yeah, the title really spoke to me. And it doesn't speak to who I am now, but it spoke to who I was then.
Mm.
And so for our listeners, of course, when Debjani and I had a conversation last week, we did speak about the fact that when we say miserably successful no more, there's this sense of who is someone who's successful? Like, who is this book for? And of course, it was written for someone who has reached a certain level of success. And by that, we mean traditional success in their career. So we mean growth, title, pay grade.
Any of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Financial stability is often associated with success,
Mm-hmm.
hierarchical positions in organization. The tagline for the book is also power over stress. So that's why the idea is that a lot of times there's a direct correlation between the extent of your success and the extent of your misery and or stress.
Yeah.
So therefore, I wanted to separate the two and say, I don't want every one of us to go into an ashram or go to the Himalayas and only meditate, though that's a great career path if that suits you. Also, and so I took neuro-linguistic programming classes when I first started writing. And I said and instead of but, because the choice of words is, I want to be impeccable with my words, as in Ruiz's 4 agreement.
Yeah.
I want us to understand that one can be successful by first defining success in a way that guides you towards 1, a match for you, and 2, something that makes the world better. That may sound very naive, but we cannot live our lives on the basis of how big our house is or which fancy car we drive. There has to be more to life than that. So that was the other purpose of it, is to make us stop and think. And this is from a purely selfish point of view. They have done study after study that says people that give back in some form or fashion are happier human beings. Mm-hmm. Study after study. So be good and do good just because you will be happier. Don't even believe me at the beginning. Just practice, volunteer somewhere, help someone, give some money and just see if you feel better. Don't take my word for it.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I wanted to frame this is because as I think miserably successful no more, the piece I find really frightening is the fact that oftentimes, and this is reflected in my experience and in the experience of several people who are very close to me, we don't even notice we're miserable, right? And
Yes.
I think that's the crazy piece of the puzzle. Why is it that us human beings just are so complacent, even when we're like dying inside?
Yep.
Mm.
So one of the things that I noticed had to do with calendaring, which is understanding how we spend our time is very important. And if you find, you who are listening, that you are in a constant state of overwhelm, that you are in a constant state of being too busy, being so full of activities and yet so empty inside, that contrast, that paradox of being so full of things and so empty of true joy and feelings, that is a big wake-up call. I was actually very lucky. I was given the gift of the layoff because I would have kept marching along, busy, miserably successful, and not stopped. I was forced into one, because I didn't have a job now, I had lots of time to reflect. In two, since it was a turning point with multiple things changing in my life, that inflection point was such that I could actually think through. I did all these, took post-it flip charts, and I did all this brainstorming. I used to do strategic planning for organizations. I did it for myself. I had a 5-year plan. And in part of that, I established learning, helping, teaching with graceful, flawed authenticity. That was going to be how I lived my life. I was going to try and make the world more inclusive. And then I was going to try and focus on people being miserably successful no more and having power over stress. So I had this bundle of thoughts, and it sounds like a lot. It's actually all pretty cohesive.
It doesn't sound like a lot. The echo behind this that is coming through to me is that what it took for you to make that change was to have a cataclysmic change in your life.
Yes.
And you said you also had a health scare. And to be clear, one of the reasons why I made changes in my life is because there was a lot of death and grief and an autoimmune disease. So one of the reasons why I'm excited to have this conversation and talk about miserably successful no more is to perhaps wave the flag and say, hey guys, don't wait. Don't wait until some really big life event throws you down under and you have to re-examine your life. What reflection could you invite someone to do who perhaps had a visceral reaction to the words?
I would say that the first thing I start with, and there are some worksheets at the end of Miserably Successful No More, and I think you can even do a free Amazon lookup. You don't even have to buy the book. You can just do a free Amazon lookup and you can probably reach some of those. It's essentially to start off with, what is my vision? What is my purpose? What is my mission? I think that would be the first thing. Because a lot of times, you cannot say making more money, or you cannot say having a bigger car or house or whatever. But what's your actual, why are you on this earth? So understanding what is your purpose, it would be the first step. And then understanding, is there an incongruence between your purpose and the way you're functioning right now? And then the third step would be, is that if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like tomorrow to look like? Just one day. Not the rest of your life, but one day.
Sweet question. Oh, I love that one. Debjani, there's something that I wanted to ask you that I remember us discussing in our prior conversation last week. We talked about how it was important for you to lean on language, to have clarity, and also to drive impact. And at first, I remember hearing you talking about yourself as an inclusion catalyst. But I also heard you, and I think this was particularly noticeable in your TEDx talk, that you called yourself an exclusion exterminator. And I was wondering if you would do me the favor of telling me in depth about what you mean with both of these terms.
Absolutely. So I have a framework which is called the bridge. and it is BRIDGE. So the BR and the I is building and reinforcing inclusion, and the DGE is destroying the guardrails of exclusion. Because I had an epiphany that it's not just about increasing inclusion, we have to decrease exclusion as well. And so when I call myself an inclusion catalyst, I am using the word catalyst first in the chemistry or chemical engineering sense, where a catalyst is could be a metal like iron, which within a chemical reaction actually speeds the process of the reaction happening, the formation of ammonia or whatever the reaction is. But it itself does not get changed. And so I'm using it literally in the sense of catalyst, as in an agent of change that can help move inclusion forward quicker. But that's only for the people that are in the room. You include people that are in the room, but there are systems of inequity, structures, whereby a lot of people are excluded, or bias and stereotyping, where we are exclusionary. In trying to be exclusive, we are exclusionary. And so I decided that I needed a strong term. So exclusion exterminator, it's not enough to say I don't like intolerance or bigotry or hatred. I will stamp it out. I will get rid of it. I want to use a strong term, and I invite people to be exclusion exterminators with me, because good people saying nothing when bad things happen is not enough anymore. We have to actively reduce exclusion and bias and all the isms and sexism and racism and misogyny and labels and hatred. We just have to reduce it actively. So that's why I chose that term.
I have to tell you, it really speaks to me. I find that it grabbed my attention, and I could have just leaned on the first label, right? I also like that you call yourself a catalyst, but how did you first come to find that term and to identify in this way?
Thank you so much. And I think that's one of the things that I find is that I have all these ideas that I read about or hear about. So catalytic converters, catalysis itself was one of my subjects in chemistry and chemical engineering, and I just tucked it away in my mind. And then when I was trying to apply some of these science and physical concepts to behaviors, the term just popped into my mind. That's what I want to be. I want to be a catalyst. I want to speed inclusion. And the immediate definition applied so well for behavior. So it just popped into my head.
Yeah, it really does. And I identified as a catalyst for change. That's also one of the things I foster and I help in clients, whether it's corporate clients or individual clients. And so I immediately felt very comfortable with that. But I love understanding the framework and the depth of it in your mind as well. It's very special. So talking about the importance about creating that change faster, I've mentioned it before, but images and stories that you shared, either in the books or in the talks, that really sort of weighed on me. And there was one in particular about a little boy and an airplane. Would you tell us that story to frame why we need to all consider becoming exterminators?
Yes, indeed. I was doing a session with the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity. We were doing a session on some of these concepts such as micromessaging. We addressed teachers, administrators, principals on how to make sure that every student has the equal right and almost walks into a classroom and feels that they should succeed, they must succeed. And one of the instructors who was in the audience, the people that we were teaching, she gave this story of how she had been in a plane with her little 2-year-old boy. And when it's midway through, the flight attendant said that the pilot wanted to speak to her little boy. And so she was very excited, and they both went up, and then the pilot came out from the cockpit, and they have these little pins or brooches, depending on which country you're coming from, with little flyers. And so the captain wanted to put that little pin on the 2-year-old child. And the pilot happened to be a woman. And so this mother, she noticed that her son's eyes widened and he didn't say anything. And of course, they had the conversation. The little brooch was pinned onto the little boy. And then that ended and they were driving back. And as they were driving back, the mother noticed that the little 2-year-old son of hers was just crying and crying. And so she said, what happened? Because this was such a joyous, positive event. So she said, what happened? And the little 2-year-old said, that wasn't a pilot. That wasn't a real pilot. And she said, what do you mean? And then this little 2-year-old child said, because a pilot is a man. And just the thought of what we are doing as a society, where a little 2-year-old child emphatically believes, quote unquote, knows that a pilot is a man. My sister and brother-in-law, they are pilots. This whole concept, and when we talk about language, it made me so sad. There is so much to be done for us to change language, for us to change these strongly held concepts and beliefs of who should be in what career, of who should inhabit what role in life. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, and we talk about sorting hats and are you a Hufflepuff or a Ravensclaw or a Slytherin or whatever. You should be able to do your own sorting hat. You shouldn't be told, oh, you're a boy, you go into that sorting hat, and you're a girl, you go there. That's not the way life should be.
Yeah. Now, I realized that we opened a door really early in our conversation that we didn't close, which was a story about how you were meant to go to Harvard and then declined going to Harvard. Can you please tell me that story?
Absolutely. So this happened actually twice. The first time I had just finished my engineering in IIT, chemical engineering, and I applied for an MBA, and I received admission to the Harvard Business School. And I declined for personal reasons. Perhaps I didn't understand exactly, being quite young, the value of that MBA from Harvard. Also, there were very strong personal reasons why I wanted to stay back in India. So that was the first time. I remember the first day that I instead went to IIM, amazing organization, loved it, and they were having a mixer. And the first question that someone asked me, one of my classmates, is, there's this rumor that you declined Harvard to come to IIM. Is that true? And I was like, yes, but how on earth would you know that? So that was the first time. The second time was after I had done my MBA and I had worked for a couple of years in the Tata Administrative Services task. And then I was planning to come to the US and I had applied to Harvard. And this time I didn't just get an admission, it was for their PhD program also in the School of Management. And I received a scholarship. It was named like a fellowship where if I worked for a couple of years after completing my PhD, it was completely, everything was free. The tuition, everything, the coursework, everything was free. That time I declined again for personal reasons. But what was really sad about that was when I sent the rejection, that was in the days of mail. I mailed the rejection back to Harvard and it got lost in the mail. So the default address, the secondary address was my parents' home. And I had, unfortunately, I didn't do that at all, but I had lied to my parents saying I didn't get into Harvard because I knew that if I told them I got into Harvard and it was this amazing, everything paid offer, that they wouldn't understand. And so I just lied and said I didn't get into Harvard. Harvard sent a second letter with all the details of the admission and the financial aid and everything. And that went to my parents' address. And my father opened that letter and he knew not only that I had got in, but that I had lied to him. And it broke his heart. And that's the reason, Anne, I have decided, even though my father is no more, sometime in my life, I don't yet know, I'm putting out there into the universe, I would like to do something at Harvard. I don't know if it's give a keynote. I don't know if it's do a session, be a guest lecturer. There are schools of gender studies or the School of Business, but I'm putting it out there in the universe just so that my Father, who's behind my shoulder or up in the heavens, just so that he knows I made it to Harvard at some point.
Yes. I'm sure it will happen. Now, is there anything you would like to add before I ask you a few select closing questions that I like to ask all of my guests?
One of the things that I've realized is that in life, this is something I heard in a conference when I was speaking at the IEEE conference in California. And this woman on a panel said there are 3 kinds of people. One of them that try and put you down because maybe they are jealous or envious, or they feel if you are less, they become more. So stay away from them. There are people that try and support you as you are right now, which is excellent. There is a third and rare caliber of people that see who you can be one day and support that person. And if you ever find that person or that group of people, keep them close to you. And I have been so blessed. A shout out to all the people that see me as I can be one day and are there to support me. So that's been huge in this. I look back on my career journey, and from being laid off, it's surreal to see who knew, crossing 1 million views on TEDx talks, and the books are international bestsellers. Who knew this would happen? It's because of these people that saw who I could be.
That's fantastic. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say this in those words, but it's making me want to think about how I look at my friendships. Am I reflective of what my friends could be? Because, right, we can also become that person for others. It's not just finding them in and around.
Yes.
We have come to the end of our conversation, or let's say this conversation, because I think we should have more conversations in the future, not just on this podcast. Debjani, it was such a pleasure to talk to you, to get to know you better, to get to ask you so many questions. I want to say thank you as well for having the guts to post about that other interview you did on the WhatsApp group that we are on together, because otherwise I would never have necessarily, well, never say never, but I perhaps through other means we would have come into contact with each other. But I loved listening to you that time, and I loved reading your book, and I can't wait for the next one. Now, if people are excited about what you do and want to get in touch or find out more, can you just tell us where they can find you?
First of all, thank you so much for saying that. And it's been such a pleasure. And I'm so glad you enjoyed the earlier podcast and the books. I think the easiest way to get a hold of me is through LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn with my name, Debjani Biswas. And if they're looking for books or TEDx talks, you just do a Google or look on Amazon. But I think the easiest way to get in touch with me is connect with me on LinkedIn. It would be helpful if you just give a sentence which says, I heard your podcast or something when you're sending the invite. And that way I know the context. And that would be the easiest way to connect.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, thank you. I hope that you have a wonderful month of August off, if I'm correct. Have great holidays with your family, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was such a pleasure connecting with you.
Same here. Take care.
You too.
So, friends and listeners, thanks again for joining me today. If you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe to the show on the platform of your choice. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at Anvi on Threads, on Instagram, Anvi Muhlethaler on LinkedIn. If you don't know how to spell it, the link is in the notes. Or on Instagram at _out of the clouds, where I also share daily musings about mindfulness. You can find all of the episodes of the podcast and much more on the website outoftheclouds.com. If you'd like to find out more from me, I invite you also to subscribe to the Meta View, my weekly newsletter where I explore coaching, brand development, conscious communication, and the future of work. That's the Meta View with 2 T's, themetaview.com. So that's it for this episode.
thank you so much for listening to Out of the Clouds. I hope that you will join me again next time. Until then, be well, be safe, and take care.